Hey guys, Kristy Rice here with another demo for you today. Pulling out my brushes, I'm going to be working on kind of a free-form watercolor pattern of peonies and plums. Just pulling out a couple brushes here. I use a variety. The last two that I pulled out were Royal and Langnickel Majestic Dagger brushes, number, I think they're 1/4 inch and 1/8 of an inch. I'm also pulling out a silver black brush. I forget the exact name of them. I'll put them below in the description that I just picked up and I've been using lately. They're really fun. And my palette there on the right, if you guys have seen me paint before, you'll know that I use a combination of M. Graham, Winsor & Newton Professional Series, pure pigment that I mix myself, and Daniel Smith, of course. So we're going to get things going here. I am going to go into a time lapse so we can speed things up here a bit. Start mixing. I tend to mix a lot right in the color wells. I don't do a ton of mixing on the actual palette. So I'm just laying down the color straight from the brush. I'm not adding water to the paper first. Starting a peony here with a real dusty rose. I like to stay really loose in the beginning, but I don't stay terribly loose for long. Here's another peony, kind of like a coral charm peony. I am not working from any specific visual references. If you guys have followed me on Instagram lately, you'll know that I'm trying to push myself away from using photograph references all the time in my work. I'm trying to go from memory a little bit more, adding some leaves here. For anyone who's just beginning in watercolor, I use a lot of different pressure on my brush, and that's something to really think about when you're just starting out. Really think about, if I press down a lot on my brush, I'm going to create a really broad stroke, but if I barely touch the paper with my brush, I'm going to have a really thin stroke. So you can get a lot out of one brush, for example, just by changing your pressure. You'll notice I'm going back into the plums, pulling out some color, dropping in some other color. I love a little bit of that green in the eggplant purple color. Doing the same here in the peony. Pulling out color with a dry, clean brush and blotting on a paper towel. Pulling out again there. See that petal coming to life just by pulling out color with a dry, clean brush. Going back in there behind the petal with some darker tones of berry. So it's a lot of push and pull with this technique. Putting color on, putting water on, and then pulling it back off with a dry, clean brush. More of that here on the plum. And now I'm going in with a really rich indigo right on the edge. The plum is still a little bit wet, so it's taking that indigo and just soaking it in and blurring lines a little bit, but not too much. So as you're working through your painting, keep in mind areas that are still wet and work back into those areas before they dry completely to get some really cool effects. And there you go again, push and pull, adding water, pulling it back out. Starting to add some layers of color as these areas dry. I use a lot of Daniel Smith Moon Glow lately. Was recently introduced to that particular pigment and I'm absolutely in love with it. So the plums there, you're seeing a lot of the Moon Glow. As the Moon Glow dries, it granulates, which means the particles of pigment kind of separate and spread on the page and reveal themselves. So when you first lay down Moon Glow and a lot of other colors from Daniel Smith, as they dry, they change and they separate. Really interesting effects. I'm using a smaller brush here. It's a number 6 round. And adding in leaves and a little bit of branches and vines. And again, really playing with the push and the pull, the pressure on your brush. A great exercise that you can do as a beginner is to fill a page with leaves and do your best to create as many different shapes, widths, lengths, sizes of leaves as you can with one brush. Don't worry about the color you're using. Don't worry about, using a variety of brush sizes. Choose one brush, one color, and see how much variety you can fill that page with. It's a great exercise. I highly recommend it. And see, those plums are still wet, so I can still go back into them and add color. Now, obviously, I've been painting for years. This composition that I'm creating is not something you most likely will be able to tackle, so to speak, as a beginner. However, I'm using a lot of really lovely techniques that you can master fairly quickly. So don't be overwhelmed by the thought of trying to copy what I'm doing. Just think about the techniques that I'm using, the way I'm holding the brush. Pause the video, review, and really look at how I'm using the brush, how much water is on my brush. I'm adding in some really fun thin lines. It's a great technique with a thin brush and very little pressure. Just add in some wispy details. You can do that too. You can fill an entire page with wispy lines. See how thin you can get them and how smooth you can get them. It's a great exercise. Adding more detail into the peony up top here. Again, this is truly an imaginary peony with really beautiful, graceful, wispy petals and a fluffy center that I'm going to start detailing soon. Going down to the yellow flower at the bottom with a thin number 2 round brush and adding some really thin line work, which is kind of a signature look of mine. And again, just going back to a beginner's perspective, a great technique and exercise is to fill a page with thin lines. Get them as graceful and flowing and even as you can. And you'll see how much you'll improve just after filling a page. From when you started at the beginning of the page to the end, you'll be really, really surprised and hopefully delighted at how far you'll come with just that bit of practice. Now my plums are drying, so I'm going back in with detail, darker detail that is not spreading as much, and that's a mindful choice. So of course with watercolor, remember the first color you lay down, it'll only stay wet for so long. Now you can always put water back on top of a completely dry area and add another layer of color. That is called glazing. A little bit more of an advanced technique, but it's something lovely to play around with. Adding some detail to that little peony bud there. And see, that pink is still really wet, but I'm going ahead in with the green. It's okay. Let it bleed together a little bit. Adds a lot of interest. It's another technique that you can use. Not so much a technique as a experiment, a practice, is to fill a page with round-ish shapes. And I say ish because it's very hard to make a perfect circle freehand, but it can be fun to practice your hand at round shapes with, again, one size brush over and over and over again. And it will really get your hand familiar with creating those shapes with the brush, getting familiar with your brush and how it moves and works. A little bit off the page here, but that's okay. I'm going to add in some more buds. Again, that round shape comes into great use here. Some leaves. So really, this video is all about giving you guys a sense of great techniques to use starting out. Don't overwhelm yourself with trying to make your painting look exactly like mine. Just commit to examining the brushstrokes that I'm using. Again, pause this, look at things again and again, and then go ahead and do some practice sheets. fill a couple sheets with thin lines with one brush, leaf shapes with another, round shapes with another. And I think you'll really see some great results from a little bit of practice, repetitive practice like that. I'm going back into this yellow flower here and adding some definition with a very contrasting color, an opera rose, to define some of the petals and how they overlap one another. And I've been using, again, the push and pull technique a lot here, where I'm adding color in, but then lifting it out with a clean, dry brush and blotting on my paper towel. That seems to be the theme here with this particular pattern. Now I'm going to go back into this peony and add a good amount of detail. When you're working in detail, at least for me, I don't have as much water on my brush. A lot of pigment, not as much water as if I were doing a wash. And I'm barely putting any pressure on this brush. This is a dagger brush from Royal and Langnickel. Again, I will add the sources below. But I can get a really fine line here or a really wide stroke. Just added another petal there because it felt right. And there it is again, that push and pull. I laid down color and now I'm taking it back out. I want some more definition on that bottom petal, so I'm going to add some bold color behind to help the front petals feel like they're popping out at the viewer. More of that over here on the right, on the alizarin crimson. Kind of like a wine color. Now I'm going to go in with some really dark tones. I'm just picking up a bunch of different colors from the palette to create a really just dark, neutral dark. And I'm going in to help that flower center just pop. I'm going to continue around the circumference of the center there with that dark, dark, dark tone. Not a lot of water on my brush right now. A lot of pigment, not a lot of water. And I'm using just the tip of my brush on this dagger. Comes to a beautiful point. If you don't put a lot of pressure on the point, you get a lot of control, a lot of fine line capability. Just going right around. Keep that paper towel handy as you work. It's so important. See, I have mine there in the bottom right. I often will hold it in my opposite hand. I'm taking that dark, dark color again. You can mix that by just choosing a bunch of dark colors from your palette, mixing them together, pulling some color back out, but it's just about adding some depth and dimension here. Going to zoom in a bit so you can see a little bit closer what I've been working on here. And I would most likely continue on this, add more detail, build and build and build the detail with the fine brush strokes with that dagger brush. Again, I'll put the sources in the description below. But guys, thank you so much for